Alfred Morrison wasn't the type of man who sought attention. At 52 years old, the former Army sergeant had settled into a quiet life in Lansing, Michigan, working as a maintenance supervisor at a local community college and spending his weekends volunteering at the Veterans Affairs office. He had kind eyes that crinkled when he smiled, a deliberate way of speaking that made people feel heard, and a reputation for showing up when others needed help. But in January 2012, Alfred Morrison became something more than a quiet veteran. He became a national hero. It started with a phone call to the Leelanau County Sheriff's Office on a brutally cold Saturday evening. A frantic mother reported that her 17-year-old daughter hadn't returned from what was supposed to be a day trip to Sleeping Bear Dunes with 4 friends. The temperature had dropped to -15 degrees. A winter storm was rolling in from Lake Michigan, and somewhere in that frozen wilderness, 5 teenagers were missing. Search and rescue teams mobilized immediately, but the conditions were treacherous. Visibility was near zero. The wind chill made it feel like -40 degrees. After 3 hours of searching, the official teams were pulled back for safety reasons, told they'd resume at first light. Alfred Morrison was visiting his sister in Traverse City that weekend. When he heard about the search on the local news, something in him wouldn't let it rest. He'd done cold weather survival training in the Army. He knew those woods, and he knew that by morning, those kids might be dead. Against all advice, Alfred drove his truck as close to the search area as possible, then set out on snowshoes with nothing but a headlamp, a GPS unit, and a veteran's stubborn refusal to leave anyone behind. For 6 hours, he pushed through whiteout conditions, following a hunch about an old ranger cabin he remembered from hiking trips years earlier. At 2:47 a.m., he found them. All 5 teenagers were huddled in that cabin, hypothermic and terrified, but alive. One of them, a girl named Stephanie Hartwell, was barely conscious. Alfred made a fire, radioed for help, and stayed with those kids until rescue teams could reach them at dawn. Doctors later said that without Alfred's intervention, at least 2 of them wouldn't have survived the night. The story went viral. Alfred appeared on morning news shows, was honored by the governor, and received letters from across the country. The parents of those 5 teenagers called him their guardian angel. Stephanie Hartwell's father, Marcus Hartwell, a successful real estate developer, was so grateful he tried to give Alfred a new truck. Alfred politely refused, saying he was just glad everyone was safe. For a man who preferred anonymity, the attention was overwhelming. But Alfred handled it with the same quiet grace he brought to everything else. He gave a few interviews, accepted the commendations with humility, and then deliberately stepped back from the spotlight. By late 2012, the media had moved on to other stories, and Alfred Morrison returned to his routine life in Lansing. He went back to fixing broken heating systems and counseling veterans struggling with PTSD. He called his elderly mother every Sunday. He met friends for coffee at the same diner every Wednesday morning. To everyone who knew him, Alfred Morrison was exactly what he appeared to be, a genuinely good man who had done something extraordinary and wanted nothing more than to return to being ordinary. But someone, somewhere, was watching Alfred Morrison very carefully, and that someone harbored feelings that had nothing to do with gratitude. March 17, 2015, started like any other Tuesday for Alfred Morrison. He worked his shift at Lansing Community College, fixing a temperamental boiler in the science building and joking with the faculty about Michigan's refusal to admit spring had arrived. He stopped at the grocery store on his way home, picking up ingredients for the chili he planned to make that weekend. His neighbor, Mrs. Chen, waved to him as he pulled into his driveway at 6:23 p.m. Everything was perfectly, unremarkably normal. Alfred ate dinner, watched a basketball game, and called his mother around 9 p.m. for their regular Tuesday chat. They talked about his sister's new job, complained about potholes, and made plans for Easter dinner in a few weeks. His mother would later tell police that Alfred sounded completely like himself, relaxed, content, maybe a little tired. He went to bed around 10:30 p.m. At 2:47 a.m., Alfred's cell phone rang. His neighbor, Tom Brandeis, would later tell investigators he heard Alfred's truck start up about 10 minutes later. Tom was an insomniac who often watched late-night television with his bedroom window cracked open. He didn't think much of it at the time. Maybe Alfred got called in for an emergency at work. Maybe a friend needed help. Alfred was the kind of person who would drop everything to help someone. Tom heard the truck drive away. He never heard it come back. When Alfred didn't show up for work on Wednesday morning, his supervisor called his cell phone. No answer. She called his home phone. No answer. By noon, she was worried enough to call Alfred's sister, Karen, who lived 40 minutes away. Karen immediately knew something was wrong. Her brother was pathologically reliable. He didn't miss work. He didn't ignore phone calls. Something had happened. Karen drove to Alfred's house, let herself in with her spare key, and found everything exactly as her brother would have left it. His bed was unmade. His wallet was on the kitchen counter. His work boots were by the door. But his truck was gone. And so was Alfred. She called the police. Initially, the Lansing Police Department treated it as a possible medical emergency or voluntary departure. Alfred was an adult with no history of mental health issues or suicidal ideation, but maybe he'd had some kind of crisis. Maybe he needed space. They put out a bolo for his vehicle and started making calls. Then, 27 hours after Alfred disappeared, a farmer named Dale Hutchins was checking his vineyard on Old Mission Peninsula, nearly 140 miles north of Lansing, when he spotted a truck parked in a clearing near his property. The engine was running. The driver's door was hanging open. Snow had drifted into the cab, and nobody was inside. Dale called the police, and within an hour, they'd confirmed it was Alfred Morrison's truck. The scene was baffling. Alfred's cell phone was on the passenger seat, powered off. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no evidence of violence. His keys were still in the ignition. A travel mug of cold coffee sat in the cup holder. It was as if Alfred had simply stopped, gotten out of his truck, and walked away into the frozen Michigan landscape. But why? Why would a man drive 140 miles in the middle of the night to an isolated vineyard on Old Mission Peninsula? Why would he leave his truck running? And where did he go? The Michigan State Police took over the investigation. Search teams scoured the area for days, using dogs, helicopters, and thermal imaging. They dragged nearby ponds. They interviewed the property owner, neighboring residents, and everyone who knew Alfred. Nobody had answers. Nobody had seen anything. It was as if Alfred Morrison had simply vanished into thin air. As the days turned into weeks with no trace of Alfred, investigators began to suspect they weren't looking at a voluntary disappearance or a tragic accident. They were looking at something far more sinister. Someone had lured Alfred Morrison out of his home in the middle of the night. Someone had brought him to that isolated vineyard, and someone knew exactly what had happened to him after that. The question was, who? And why would anyone want to harm a man who had spent his life helping others? If you're finding this story as compelling as we are, hit that subscribe button. We dive deep into true crime cases that deserve to be heard. And we've got dozens more stories coming that you won't want to miss. Detective Rachel Kowalski had been with the Michigan State Police for 14 years when she was assigned to the Alfred Morrison case. She specialized in missing persons investigations, and she knew the statistics by heart. After the first 48 hours, the chances of finding someone alive dropped dramatically. After the first week, you were usually looking for a body. After a month, you were looking at a cold case. But something about Alfred Morrison's disappearance didn't fit the usual patterns. This wasn't a spontaneous abduction or a crime of opportunity. Someone had planned this carefully. The midnight phone call, the isolated location, the complete absence of evidence. This was deliberate, calculated, and that gave Detective Kowalski hope. People who planned crimes this carefully usually left breadcrumbs, even if they didn't mean to. She started with the phone records. The call that woke Alfred at 2:47 a.m. came from a burner phone purchased with cash at a Walmart in Flint 2 weeks earlier. The call lasted 47 seconds. Security footage from that Walmart was checked and rechecked. But the buyer had been careful. They wore a bulky coat and a baseball cap pulled low, and they kept their face away from the cameras. The phone was never used again after that single call to Alfred. It was a dead end, but it told Kowalski something important. This wasn't random. Someone had planned this for at least 2 weeks. But why would Alfred respond to a call from an unknown number at 2:47 inches the morning? And what could someone possibly say to convince him to drive 140 miles to an abandoned vineyard? Kowalski interviewed everyone in Alfred's life. His family insisted he had no enemies. His coworkers described him as quiet, helpful, and universally liked. His fellow veterans at the VA called him a rock, someone people turned to in crisis. Nobody could think of anyone who would want to hurt him. His financial records were clean. No gambling debts, no suspicious transactions, no hidden problems. Alfred Morrison appeared to be exactly what he seemed. A genuinely good man, living a genuinely simple life. Then Kowalski started digging into the 2012 rescue that had made Alfred famous, and the case took its first strange turn. 4 months after Alfred disappeared, his sister Karen received an anonymous letter. It arrived in a plain envelope with no return address, postmarked from Detroit. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message that had been assembled from letters cut out of magazines, like something from a ransom note in an old movie. It read, "Ask Stephanie Hartwell what really happened in that cabin. Heroes aren't always what they seem." Karen immediately gave the letter to Detective Kowalski. It was bizarre and cryptic, but it was also the first real lead they'd had in months. Kowalski tracked down Stephanie Hartwell, now 20 years old, and studying nursing at Michigan State University. When Kowalski asked about the rescue, Stephanie became visibly uncomfortable. She was hiding something. It took 3 interviews before Stephanie finally opened up. Yes, Alfred Morrison had saved them that night. Yes, he was a hero. But there was something she'd never told anyone. Something that had bothered her for years, but that she'd been too confused and ashamed to report. After Alfred got the fire going in that cabin and the immediate danger of hypothermia had passed, he'd sat with them while they waited for rescue. Stephanie remembered being barely conscious, drifting in and out. She remembered Alfred giving her his jacket, making sure she was closest to the fire. But she also remembered something else. In her semi-conscious state, she felt someone stroking her hair. She remembered opening her eyes and seeing Alfred looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite identify. Not threatening, exactly, but intense, focused. When she was more alert, nothing inappropriate happened. Alfred was a perfect gentleman. But that moment had stuck with her. Was it innocent? Probably. Alfred had likely just been checking on her, making sure she was breathing, keeping her warm. But Stephanie had always wondered. And now, with Alfred missing, and this anonymous letter suggesting something darker, she felt guilty for even thinking it. Kowalski pursued this angle carefully. She interviewed the other 4 teenagers who'd been in that cabin. None of them reported anything inappropriate. One of them, Marcus Hartwell Jr., Stephanie's younger brother, actually got angry at the suggestion that Alfred had been anything other than heroic. But Kowalski couldn't shake the feeling that this anonymous letter meant something. Someone out there believed Alfred Morrison wasn't the hero everyone thought he was. Someone was watching this case closely enough to know that his sister Karen would take a letter seriously. And someone had a reason to want people asking questions about that rescue. Then the letters kept coming. Over the next 18 months, Karen Morrison received 7 more anonymous letters. Each one was carefully constructed from magazine cutouts, each one postmarked from a different Michigan city, and each one hinted at dark secrets about her brother. The hero had a hidden side. Some rescues create obsessions. He was following those kids long before that night. The implications were disturbing and deeply painful for a family desperately trying to find their missing loved one. Detective Kowalski had the FBI analyze the letters. The paper was generic printer stock, available at any office supply store. The glue used was standard adhesive. The magazines the letters were cut from included Time, Newsweek, and National Geographic, all common publications. There were no fingerprints, no DNA, and no digital trail. Whoever was sending these letters understood forensics. But the letters served a purpose beyond terrorizing Alfred's family. They gave Kowalski a profile of the sender. This person was organized, patient, and deeply invested in controlling the narrative around Alfred Morrison. They wanted people to question whether Alfred was truly a hero. They wanted to tarnish his reputation. This suggested someone motivated by jealousy, resentment, or a distorted sense of justice. Then, in November 2016, a true crime blogger named Jennifer Matsuda reached out to the Michigan State Police with information that cracked the case wide open. Jennifer ran a popular blog called Northern Mysteries that focused on unsolved cases in the Great Lakes region. She'd been following Alfred Morrison's disappearance closely and had dedicated several posts to the case. In response, She'd received an unusual amount of engagement from one particular anonymous commenter who used the handle Vineyard Watcher. Vineyard Watcher had posted dozens of comments over several months, always late at night, always focused on questioning Alfred's character. They posted things like, "Everyone assumed he was there by accident, but what if he'd been watching those kids? And real heroes don't need publicity tours afterward." The comments were never explicitly threatening or defamatory enough to be removed, but they created a persistent dark cloud around any discussion of the case. What caught Jennifer's attention was how much detailed knowledge Vineyard Watcher seemed to have about the case. They mentioned specific details about where Alfred's truck was found, the timeline of his disappearance, and even aspects of his daily routine that hadn't been made public. Jennifer suspected Vineyard Watcher might be connected to the investigation, possibly even to Alfred's disappearance itself. Kowalski obtained a subpoena for the IP addresses associated with Vineyard Watcher's comments. The trail led to a VPN service, then to an internet cafe in Grand Rapids, then to nothing. Vineyard Watcher knew how to cover their tracks. But the comments themselves provided valuable insight. This person was obsessed with Alfred Morrison. They thought about him constantly. They wanted others to see him differently, and they were watching the investigation closely enough to know details that shouldn't be public. Then, Kowalski's tech team made a breakthrough. Buried in the metadata of one comment, they found a fragment of code that suggested Vineyard Watcher had briefly accessed the blog through a compromised router before routing through the VPN. That router was traced to a specific neighborhood in Lansing, just 8 blocks from Alfred Morrison's house. As Kowalski's team began cross-referencing residents in that area with people connected to the 2012 rescue, a name emerged that changed everything. Marcus Hartwell Sr., Stephanie's father. The wealthy real estate developer whose daughter Alfred had saved. The man who'd tried to give Alfred a new truck in gratitude. The man who'd called Alfred a guardian angel. But when Kowalski pulled Marcus Hartwell's financial records and travel history, something didn't add up. Hartwell had been in Florida on business the night Alfred disappeared. His credit cards and cell phone records confirmed it. He couldn't have made that midnight phone call. He couldn't have been at Old Mission Peninsula. So why was the Vineyard Watcher IP trail leading back to his neighborhood? The answer came when Kowalski looked at who else lived in that same area. Marcus Hartwell's business partner, Daniel Reeves, owned a home 3 houses down from the compromised router. Reeves was 44 years old, divorced, and had worked with Hartwell for nearly a decade, building commercial properties throughout Michigan. He'd been at the hospital when the rescued teenagers arrived. He'd attended the ceremony honoring Alfred Morrison, and according to multiple sources, Daniel Reeves had been quietly in love with Marcus Hartwell's wife, Claire, for years. Suddenly, the pieces started falling into place, but Kowalski needed more than geographic proximity and unrequited love. She needed evidence, she needed proof, and she needed to figure out what Daniel Reeves could possibly gain from making Alfred Morrison disappear. The answer would come from a place Kowalski never expected. A domestic violence call 3 years later, hundreds of miles away, in a small town most people had never heard of. On February 8, 2020, police in Petoskey, Michigan responded to a domestic disturbance call at a small rental house on the outskirts of town. Neighbors reported hearing screaming and the sound of breaking glass. When officers arrived, they found a 1-year-old woman named Bethany Marsh with a split lip and bruises on her arms. Her boyfriend, 8-year-old Daniel Reeves, was arrested for domestic assault. It was a tragic but routine case. Daniel was held overnight, arraigned the next morning, and released on bond with an order to stay away from Bethany. He'd moved to Petoskey 18 months earlier, neighbors said. After some kind of business falling out in Lansing, he kept to himself, worked odd jobs, and drank too much. Nobody suspected he was connected to one of Michigan's most haunting missing persons cases. But Bethany Marsh was done protecting him. When a victim advocate came to check on her 3 days after the arrest, Bethany said something that made the advocate immediately call the police. He's been waiting 5 years for someone to find what he did. He talks about it when he's drunk. He says he's the only one who really understood what that man was. Detective Kowalski received the call on a Wednesday afternoon. She was in her car and heading north within an hour. Bethany Marsh had met Daniel Reeves in a bar in 2018. He'd seemed charming at first, attentive, generous with his money, despite working construction jobs that barely paid the bills. He talked about his past success in real estate, about business partnerships that had gone wrong, about people who hadn't appreciated his loyalty. Bethany, who was working 2 jobs to support her young daughter from a previous relationship, was drawn to his apparent worldliness. But Daniel drank heavily, and when he drank, he became someone else. Angry, paranoid, obsessive. He talked about being overlooked, being used, being invisible, while other people got credit they didn't deserve. And late at night, after too many whiskeys, he talked about Alfred Morrison. At first, Bethany thought Alfred was an old friend or rival from Daniel's real estate days. But the more Daniel drank, the more the story came out in fragments. The rescue in 2012, the media attention, the way everyone treated Alfred like a hero, and beneath it all, Daniel's consuming rage that the wrong person had been celebrated. He said Alfred didn't deserve Claire's gratitude, Bethany told Detective Kowalski, her hands shaking as she held a cup of coffee in the Petoskey Police Department interview room. He said Alfred wasn't special. He said anyone could have found those kids, but Alfred got treated like he'd saved the world. And the worst part was watching Claire look at Alfred like he was something Daniel could never be. Claire Hartwell, Marcus Hartwell's wife, Stephanie's mother. Daniel had been in love with her for years, Bethany said. He worked with Marcus, spent time at their house, watched Claire raise her children, and fantasized about a life where he was the hero of the family instead of just Marcus's business partner. When Alfred Morrison saved Stephanie's life, Claire had been overwhelmed with gratitude. She'd hugged Alfred at the hospital. She'd cried and called him an angel. She'd wanted him at every family gathering that first year. And Daniel Reeves had watched it all, consumed by jealousy that had nowhere to go. "Does Daniel own a journal?" Kowalski asked, keeping her voice carefully neutral, even as adrenaline surged through her system. "Does he write things down?" Bethany's eyes widened. "He has boxes of notebooks. He's been writing in them for years. He took them with him when we fought. They're probably at his mother's house in Kalkaska. That's where he's been staying since he got out on bond." Kowalski obtained a search warrant that same day. At 6 a.m. the next morning, a team descended on the small house in Kalkaska where Daniel's elderly mother lived. Daniel wasn't there. He'd violated his bond conditions and disappeared 2 days earlier. But in the basement, in 3 cardboard boxes stacked against the wall, investigators found 47 spiral notebooks filled with Daniel Reeves's handwriting. The journals were a window into obsession, pages and pages about Claire Hartwell, about Marcus's success, about feeling invisible and unappreciated. And then, starting in January 2012, page after page about Alfred Morrison, about the rescue, about the media attention, about Claire's gratitude. The entries grew darker and more detailed as the months passed. Daniel had researched Alfred extensively. He knew Alfred's schedule, his route to work, his favorite restaurants. He knew Alfred was a veteran who would respond to someone in crisis. And on March 15, 2015, 2 days before Alfred disappeared, Daniel had written, "Tomorrow I get the burner phone. Wednesday is the night. The vineyard where we used to take the kids when they were little. Poetic. He can be the hero one last time, except this time, nobody will know." The final entry, dated March 17, 2015, was brief. "It's done. He's at peace. I'm at peace. Claire never needs to know what I did for her." Detective Kowalski sat in that basement, holding evidence of a premeditated murder, and felt the weight of 5 years of searching finally lifting. Now she just needed to find Daniel Reeves and make him tell her where Alfred Morrison's body was buried. A statewide manhunt for Daniel Reeves began immediately. His photo was circulated to every law enforcement agency in Michigan. His credit cards were monitored. His known associates were interviewed. The FBI joined the search, concerned that Daniel might flee across state lines, or worse, harm himself before he could be taken into custody. They found him 3 days later in Traverse City, sitting in a bar just 12 miles from where Alfred Morrison's truck had been found 5 years earlier. He didn't run when police approached. He didn't resist arrest. He simply looked at Detective Kowalski with exhausted eyes and said, "I wondered when you'd figure it out. I always knew it would be you." Daniel Reeves waived his right to remain silent. In an interview room at the Michigan State Police Post, he confessed to everything. He'd purchased the burner phone 2 weeks before Alfred's disappearance, paying cash and being careful to avoid security cameras. He'd driven to Old Mission Peninsula 4 times in the weeks leading up to the murder, scouting locations and planning every detail. On March 17th, at 2:47 a.m., he'd called Alfred from that burner phone and told him there'd been an accident, that Stephanie Hartwell had been in a car crash on Old Mission Peninsula and was asking for him, that the family didn't want to worry Claire until they knew how serious it was. Could Alfred come right away? Alfred, the man who couldn't turn away from someone in need, had driven through the night to help a young woman he'd saved once before. He'd arrived at the vineyard around 4:30 a.m. Daniel was waiting. They'd talked for maybe 10 minutes before Alfred realized something was wrong. There was no accident. Stephanie wasn't there. And Daniel Reeves was looking at him with an expression Alfred couldn't quite read. "What did you say to him at the end?" Kowalski asked. Daniel's voice was flat, emotionless. "I told him he wasn't special. I told him anyone could have found those kids. I told him he didn't deserve the way Claire looked at him, and then I shot him." Daniel led investigators to a wooded area 2 miles from the vineyard. The ground was rocky, covered with brush and fallen trees. It took 8 hours of careful excavation, but they found Alfred Morrison's remains buried 4 feet down, wrapped in a tarp. He'd been shot twice in the chest with a .38 caliber handgun that Daniel had purchased illegally from a construction site acquaintance and thrown into Lake Michigan 2 days after the murder. Karen Morrison identified her brother's body through dental records. She'd spent 5 years not knowing if Alfred was alive or dead, 5 years of hoping and grieving and searching for answers. When Detective Kowalski told her they'd found him, Karen collapsed in her sister's arms and sobbed with a mixture of relief and renewed anguish. At least now she could bring him home. At least now she could say goodbye. Daniel Reeves was charged with first-degree premeditated murder, evidence tampering, and a string of related crimes. His trial began in September 2021. The prosecution presented the journals, the confession, and testimony from Bethany Marsh, forensic experts, and members of Alfred's family. Daniel's defense attorney tried to argue diminished capacity, painting a picture of a man consumed by mental illness and unrequited love. But the jury wasn't swayed. The journals made it clear. This was planned, deliberate murder driven by jealousy and a twisted sense of injustice. The most powerful testimony came from Claire Hartwell herself. Prosecutors had initially hesitated to call her, worried about putting the woman at the center of Daniel's obsession on the stand. But Claire insisted. She took the witness stand, looked directly at Daniel Reeves, and told the court exactly what she thought of him. "I trusted you," she said, her voice steady despite tears streaming down her face. "You were in my home, around my children. I thought you were Marcus's friend. And all that time, you were fantasizing about me, obsessing over a hero complex, and planning to murder a good man because you couldn't handle the fact that someone else did something brave." She paused, gathering herself. "Alfred Morrison was a genuinely decent person. You are the opposite of everything he was. And you killed him because his goodness made you feel small. That's not love. That's narcissism and evil. And I hope you spend every day of the rest of your life knowing that." On October 14, 2021, the jury found Daniel Reeves guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He showed no emotion as the sentence was read, just stared straight ahead as if none of it mattered anymore. Alfred Morrison was finally laid to rest in a ceremony attended by hundreds of people. The 5 teenagers he'd saved, now adults with families of their own, served as honorary pallbearers. Stephanie Hartwell, who'd become a trauma nurse, gave a eulogy about how Alfred's courage had given her a purpose in life, to save others the way he'd saved her. Marcus Hartwell Jr. planted an oak tree in Alfred's memory at the entrance to Sleeping Bear Dunes National Lakeshore, with a plaque that read, "In memory of Alfred Morrison, a true hero who asked for nothing but gave everything." Detective Rachel Kowalski attended the funeral, standing in the back and watching a community say goodbye to a man she'd never met but had spent 5 years of her life trying to bring home. She thought about all the hours of investigation, the dead ends, the frustration, and the moment when Bethany Marsh's phone call had finally broken the case open. Cold cases were solved by persistence, luck, and the willingness to follow every thread, no matter how small. As the ceremony ended and people began to leave, Karen Morrison approached Kowalski and hugged her tightly. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for never giving up on him." Kowalski thought about Alfred Morrison driving through a snowstorm to save 5 strangers. She thought about him answering a midnight phone call because someone claimed to need help. She thought about how the same quality that made him a hero, that fundamental inability to turn away from someone in distress, was exactly what had gotten him killed. "He deserved better," Kowalski said quietly. "He did," Karen agreed. "But at least now people will remember him for who he really was, not who Daniel Reeves tried to make him into. At least now we know the truth. And in the end, perhaps that was the only justice possible in a case like this. Not bringing Alfred back, not erasing 5 years of anguish, but ensuring that the truth was told, that the right person was held accountable, and that a genuine hero's memory wasn't destroyed by one man's twisted obsession." Before you go, if you've made it this far, please consider subscribing to our channel. Cases like Alfred Morrison's deserve to be told completely, carefully, and with respect for everyone involved. We're committed to bringing you deeply researched true crime stories, and your subscription helps us continue this work. Hit that button, and we'll see you in the next investigation. The case of Alfred Morrison is closed, but the questions it raises about jealousy, obsession, and the price of heroism remain open, haunting reminders that sometimes the most dangerous person is the one who believes they've been overlooked, invisible, in a world that celebrates someone else. Daniel Reeves will spend the rest of his life in prison, and Alfred Morrison's legacy will endure in the lives he saved and the example he set. Sometimes that's the only justice we get, and sometimes it has to be enough.